When I woke up this morning, like many of you, I was caught off guard that an emergency is going to be declared in the country. And this is extremely surprising because just a day before, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin said an MCO would come into effect in many states worst hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how do we make sense of this? Well, the best way, I think, would be to call up two experts who could possibly shed some light on the situation.
So I think the declaration of emergency is not surprising. We know that he tried before. The Argong did not agree to it. But I suppose we have to give him the benefit of the doubt that this time it was driven purely by the COVID-19 crisis. If we look around the world, we can see that the new strain of COVID-19 has sort of taken off in Europe and South America. And it looks very much like we've lost control of the situation in Malaysia as well. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that this was basically done in the name of COVID-19, although I have to say that he does benefit politically from the fact that the country will be shut down until August this year.
Well, I think one of the first things that struck me was, again, the question, is this declaration of emergency really necessary? And of course, the Prime Minister was at pains to try to once again justify this request for an emergency. And I note from his speech that he talked about the deteriorating situation with COVID-19. He made a brief reference to flooding in Johor. And he brought in a new idea which we've not heard before, or he has not raised before, about the possibility of having to call on the private medical sector to assist with government efforts to combat COVID-19. So that seemed to be, giving a little bit more justification.
So some of the initial reactions we're getting from politicians right now is, why did he need to resort to an emergency? Was the MCO not good enough on its own?
I think with the emergency, it will give him enhanced powers. So, for example, under the emergency, the government will have much broader powers. An example of that is that they can use the armed forces for policing duties, which they can't do under the MCO. And it's easier for them to control the movement of goods and people across the state borders.
Well, I mean, this brings us back to the whole issue. What additional powers does the government have as a result of the declaration of emergency? And apart from the ability to pass laws as emergency ordinances very quickly, and a few other sort of procedural matters where they can, for example, call in the military and things like that. The impact of the declaration of emergency is still very much more in the political arena. It's more in the political realm. And again, you have to juxtapose, put side by side this request and this declaration of emergency with the fact that at least from 2-3 days ago, the Prime Minister's majority in the Dewan Rakyat had basically gone down to, if I'm not mistaken, 111. And then now with Datuk Sri Nazri having announced that he is withdrawing support for the government, it's down to 110.
So I can understand why people think that it's political, because if you remember when the PN government was formed on the 1st of March last year, also due to COVID, Parliament was not recalled until July for one-day sitting. So for the first 6 months of the PN government, there was basically no scrutiny or parliamentary scrutiny by the opposition on the government policies. So I suspect the same will happen. They will not recall Parliament. Even if they do recall Parliament, it will be under restricted conditions. But I think what is important for Malaysians to remember is that for the overwhelming majority of Malaysians, I think the politics thing is on the one side, but much more importantly, I think, is the fact that we have sort of lost control over the COVID-19 crisis. And also, much more importantly, somehow, even with the passing of the budget, we have not been able to restart our economy. So if we keep losing control of the COVID-19 or the fight against COVID-19 and we cannot restart our economy, the consequences, believe me, are much, much worse than whether the opposition can scrutinize government policies.
But you cannot deny, you cannot, sort of put aside the worsening political situation where the Prime Minister is concerned. And really, at the end of the day, the Prime Minister couldn't run away from it. Towards the end of his speech, he spent about 3 or 4 paragraphs, of his statement, once again returning to the idea that this is not, an attempt to cling on to power, and that, as soon as practicable after 1st of August, elections will be called and things like that. So I think he's, admitting that there is a political aspect to this emergency rule. And, given that it's going to go for between now and then, 6+ months, anything can happen, and, there is no guarantee that things will change.
That with the country shut down for 6 months, or what does this mean for UMNO's push to get rid of the PN government? The bottom line is that UMNO and PAS will no longer be able to push for general election as long as the country is under emergency rule, and that most political activities in the country will have to stop at least for the next 6 months. This gives Muhyiddin a 6-month breathing space for him to strengthen Bersatu, especially in the Malay areas, so that by the time we come out of the emergency, hopefully by August this year, he will be in a much better spot to confront UMNO and PAS. But purely from his perspective, I think this is a very good thing, because he does not want an early general election, because he knows that in the core rural Malay areas, Bersatu is still relatively weak compared to PAS and UMNO.
So now that we're talking about elections, right? Yesterday, Nazri Aziz called for a press conference. We were expecting him to probably cancel it or maybe like postpone the PC today. That's going to happen in probably a few minutes. But he hasn't done that yet. He says it's still going on. So it seems like the UMNO leaders are still very much holding on to the position where they want to challenge Muhyiddin and Bersatu. So is that something you're getting as well?
Yes, I think it's quite clear that within UMNO, the key factions led by Najib and Zahid, they think that this is the time to strike. They know that if they can hold a general election in the short term, then Bersatu is very likely to be wiped out in the core Malay areas. The calculation in UMNO is that UMNO combined with PAS will probably win somewhere between 50 to 70 seats in the Malay areas. So they can bring new allies into the equation and they can actually take over the government. Muhyiddin knows this, and that's the reason why he is trying his best to delay the general election. So in some ways, this emergency proclamation is actually a very good cover for him to delay the elections and to provide with him a political breathing space until August this year.
And so it remains to be seen, how many MPs will continue to make public declarations of the withdrawal of support and things like that. And will there come a point in time when the position of the Prime Minister becomes so politically untenable that he really has to do the decent thing, even in a period where you have a declaration of emergency? I mean, government functions, government continues to function. So, if he realizes that, the writing is on the wall and enough MPs have withdrawn support from him, he should then, even though we are still in a period of emergency, do the decent thing and go to the Yang di-Tuan Agong and say to Tuan Khoo that, I've lost the support of the majority of the Dewan Rakyat. Here's my resignation.
What is really interesting about this declaration of emergency is that now the UMNO General Assembly at the end of this month can't be held unless they do it virtually. So that will be interesting, because this means that the two factions in UMNO can't have an open confrontation. I think a lot of people were looking forward to the open confrontation on the floor of the UMNO General Assembly to see which side have the upper hand. So of course, between now and August, we'll see a lot of shadow boxing. But much more importantly, I think no matter how they play the game, Muhyiddin is out front at least for the next few months.
But when COVID-19 is, I'm not saying the government is doing this, but if the perception is that people see the government using COVID-19 as a camouflage for political maneuverings and machinations, then trust in the government is eroded. And trust in our democratic institutions is also eroded. And this may have a longer-term negative effect on our nation as compared with COVID-19 itself.